Okay, I'll be recording just a brief lecture on African-centered psychology from chapter 2. And it's from Belgrave and Allison's text, African-centered psychology. So I'll be doing at least one of these for each chapter, just for those who are interested and want to follow along. Again, that's Belgrave and Allison's book, African American Psychology. So I begin with a quote from Stephen Biko, and if you're interested in the notes that I'm using for this, I could send those to you. All you have to do is email me in the link below, or the email that I'll put below, and I will get that information out to you. So Stephen Biko, who was in the South African apartheid movement, had this to say, and he was talking about the youth movement. He said that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And I'll say that again, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Once again, that's Stephen Biko. And if you're looking for more writings about Stephen Biko, he wrote a book called I Write What I Like. So that's coming from Azania. And that's what the original people from South Africa call it, not necessarily South Africa. Such a generic term. Anyways, moving on. So some of the topics we'll cover is some different vocabulary, African-centered psychology in its current state, some seminal psychologists who've contributed to the concepts of African-centered psychology, discuss a bit of African philosophy and worldviews, and a few empirical studies. So the vocabulary that I think is good to know to start with is worldview, kind of how you see the world, and I'll break that down a little bit more. Afrocentric or African-centered, Eurocentric or European-centered, spirituality, collectiveness, right? Time orientation and flexibility, right? Orality, sensitivity, right? Verve and rhythm, balance and harmony, and orientation, and then kind of breaking that up, right? Because I was giving you some examples of particularly African-centered ideas and psychology that's come from that, but also the term empirical versus a framework, and particularly we're talking psychology, we're talking a psychological framework, and then some other psychosocial outcomes to consider. And so again, worldview, African-centered, Eurocentric, European-centered, spirituality, collectiveness, time orientation, orality, sensitivity, verve, rhythm, balance and harmony, empirical framework, psychosocial outcomes. Right. That's the vocabulary I want you to be aware of and be able to not only know, but use, right? There's no point in vocabulary if you can't use it. The reason why I begin with vocabulary, because vocabulary allows you to begin to change your thinking. It allows you to begin to put new ideas out there. Going back to at least the concept of a framework, it's kind of like the boards to build the building. The vocabulary helps you with that. And if you have new vocabulary, you can build new buildings. Okay. So Cheryl Wade Grills, who is a dean of psychology out in California at Loyola Marymount University. She's also a former president of the Association of Black Psychologists at a key time in my life, in particular when the convention came to Los Angeles. She was able to bring people who were able to participate in psychology in a way that traditionally they hadn't when they came to a convention. So we brought together a directory of Black mental health providers and people who were doing front lines work on working with folks with drug and alcohol issues, HIV and AIDS, dealing with past trauma, dealing with resolving conflict, that type of thing. Whereas a lot of clinicians, they typically go to conventions and they just kind of sit in the background. These folk came in and like, nah, we want to learn how to do this work, but also develop this directory. So although Dr. Grills is very much a strong theorist, she travels back and forth to Africa, getting deeper in understanding African and particularly West African theories and ideas. she comes back to my home of Southern California and really works with folks very directly. So here's one of the things that she said, and she's defining African-centered psychology. African psychology consists of African values, ways of accessing knowledge, ways of defining reality, ways of governing and interpreting behavior, social relations, and designing environments to sustain healthy adaptive functioning among people of African descent. So that brings us to a worldview. We kind of brought in the lens a bit, we're going to take it back a bit. And here's a definition of a worldview that's coming from Belgrave and Allison's book. A worldview is a way of thinking that organizes all aspects of one's life, including intra and interpersonal thoughts and behaviors in one's functioning in social systems and institutions in the community. So if I have an Afro-centered or Afro-centered worldview, right? According to Dr. Molefe Asante, who is the chair of Black Studies or Africana Studies at Temple University, the first PhD program in Black Studies in the United States. Here's what he has to say about this particular lens. Afrocentricity is a mode of thought and action in which the centrality of African interests, values, and perspectives dominate, placing of African people at the center, right? Again, thought and action and the interests and values and perspectives of African people are at the center, right? So one direct concept that, at least for me growing up, that gave me an African lens was Muhammad Ali. And I'm using a quote from him, and I'm watering it down a bit, just because, I can never do Muhammad justice. But the quote goes like this. And they were talking about sending him to war, drafting him into the military, and his response was, ain't no Viet Cong ever called me the N-word, right? And if you're not familiar with the N-word, you're gonna have to look that up. But basically what he's saying is that the people in the country of Vietnam hadn't discriminated against him. His fight, and what he went on to say, is that you're my oppressor right here in America, particularly during the time when segregation of Black people from public spaces was legal. So he chose to put his fight right in front of him, and that was very much an international African-centered worldview. All right. So if I were to compare and contrast African versus European-centered worldviews, African-centered is derived from African culture, European-centered is derived from European culture. And I give an example of two different songs, one by the Williams Brothers. It's an older song, but it's about sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with people, but particularly helping people in day-to-day issues, right? The Williams version song, if you look it up, it's by the Williams Brothers. And it goes like this: I'm just a nobody trying to help anybody and tell them about somebody who can save everybody, right? Casting Crowns has a more, what they call, contemporary gospel version, more European-centered version, and it sounds like it's more coming out of their own individualized viewpoint, right? And provides a cultural template for this individualistic notion of how Europeans see the world. And we'll break that down a little bit more, but I wanted to give you kind of this comparison and contrast. So if you're at home, and especially if you're looking at YouTube, take a look at the Williams Brothers version of the song. I'm just a nobody versus Casting Crowns, I'm just a nobody version of the song. And you'll hear what they do at the beginning of the song, which orients it slightly differently. And that's just one small version. There's many other different versions or different types of songs that have been covered back and forth by each other. But sometimes it's the context by which the person says it. And it has nothing to do with the intent, but it is the context of who, where, what, when, and why. Okay. So if I were to take a look at American African-centered research in America, and then African psychology in Africa, you will see some difference. African-centered research in America has been going on for 60 plus years, Whereas in Africa, really, it's been limited over the last few years, but it's growing, right? And so we have the Journal of Black Psychology and the Journal of Black Studies, which are nearly 60 years old. And then the South African Journal of Psychology and the Journal of Psychology in Africa, which are a little more than a couple of decades old, right? African-centered research in America is based on African frames and using African ideas from all over the continent. Whereas African psychology, or at least psychology in Africa, often uses Western frameworks as well as African frames from time to time. Okay. African-centered psychology in America focuses on identity, and quite a bit of the research has been on identity, whereas African psychology in Africa focuses on the day-to-day challenges. And it really, in essence, it boils down to Africans studying psychology in Africa know who they are, so they don't have to spend a lot of time wondering about who they are. And those of us in America, we don't know who we are. I just took a DNA test trying to figure out who I am, where I come from, right? I have some ideas, right? And it's not just based upon DNA and some scientific lab, but also based upon the food I eat, based upon kind of the ways of being that I appreciate. So I went to Ghana, and there was food that was similar to just like my mother grew up eating in West Texas: black-eyed peas, greens, fried chicken, all these different types of food that were very familiar, and I felt very much at home in Africa. So take that for what it's worth, right? So discussing more of, these ideas, and particularly towards this idea of an African-centered psychology, although many would consider Dr. Joseph White, who I'm about to quote here, one of the founding members of the Association of Black Psychology, would consider him more of a black psychologist, in that he didn't walk around quoting a lot of African theories and ideas, but he still wanted to view the world from his lens as a black person, and particularly as a black American, but definitely as a black person first. So here's what he said. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to understand the lifestyles of black people using traditional theories developed by white psychologists to explain white people. Moreover, when these traditional theories are applied to the lives of black folks, many incorrect, weakness-dominated and inferior-oriented conclusions come about, right? So if we're applying someone else's lens or someone else's kind of way of looking at life to black people, we're often going to come to some incorrect assumptions. And prior to the late 1960s and the Association of Black Psychologists coming about, people really hadn't focused in on saying, let's look at this from our own perspective. There had been starts and stops, but there hadn't been a sustained effort to do that, to develop an institution that would do that. And Joe White was a part of developing that. But I'm going to mention some psychologists here to start with. And as I mentioned, Joe White, right? Joe White also, he's very instrumental in, particularly after 1965 riots in Los Angeles. He's living in Southern California. He's one of the first clinical black psychologists in the state of California. And he sees the needs of people from day to day, and he says, look, we need to develop and train psychologists and doctors and lawyers. And so he works at Cal State Long Beach, works at UC Irvine, and he's instrumental in getting those things going, also developing programs, particularly the Educational Opportunity Program. Another seminal psychologist that we should think about is Asa Hilliard, and he takes Joe White's idea and expands it to looking at classical African civilizations to better define black psychology, to come from that theory and history, as psychology has come from many Greek ideas, but even kind of following a cue from Freud and Jung, taking a look at Egyptian psychology and Egyptian philosophies and ideas. Dr. Kobe Cambone, who passed away recently. So Joe White and Asa Hilliard, they have passed away, but Dr. Kobe Cambone passed away the most recently. And he wanted to begin measuring our Afrocentric values. And what was important about those measurements, we'll break down a little bit more, but him and people like Robert Guthrie, who's both of these two I just mentioned, Kobe Campbell and Robert Guthrie, are affiliated with Florida A&M. They also looked at measuring the best of African people and ways in which to predict their ability to overcome challenges that may come forward. I mentioned Cheryl Grills, who took a lot of African-centered theory and applied those to programs to empower Black people. Right, Cheryl Grills, she's still with us, but those first three, I did want to start with them. And I got a chance to meet all of them and learn from them at the Association of Black Psychologists conventions. Wade Nobles, as well, is a African-centered theorist who's at the University of San Francisco, or San Francisco State, I should say, San Francisco State. And he developed programs, particularly in the 80s and 90s, where people were not using African-centered theory to treat people with HIV and AIDS. He also taught Black studies. Some of the other folks that we wanted to take a look at were Linda James Myers, who developed an optimal psychology. And she's essentially asking what is right with and where can Black people go to develop greater resilience and to grow. And this optimal psychology takes us beyond this look of deficit model thinking. Right? And finally, Dr. Naeem Akbar took a look at natural psychology. And at Oakwood, we've read quite a bit from a woman named Ellen G. White, and some of her work did something similar in education, looking at kind of how nature works. And if I can follow one piece here, taking a look at the caterpillar growing into a cocoon, coming into a butterfly, and this transformative process, but we can learn from that in our own human transformative processes. Okay. All right. So if we get into some of the issues, and I have some other notes in front of me as well, but if I break down African-centered belief systems, I could compare and contrast that, and if you're interested in the notes, you can get that. But for this video, I'd really like to spend some time looking at what are important belief systems for African-centered folk. And so we talked about a vocabulary earlier: spirituality, collectivism, time orientation, orality, sensitivity to affect and emotional cues, verve and rhythm, balance and harmony. I want to take a look at those things. So let's start with spirituality. Spirituality is interwoven in all aspects of life. There's no separation between spirituality and everyday activities. Whereas we may pray at a meeting, like for example, at Cal State University Long Beach, we have a Black graduation celebration, and I hate to break it to some folks who just think this might be crazy, but we pray and to loud applause. Folks are very excited because they usually don't get a chance to pray in those spaces. Right? Collectivism is the next area. In the well-being of a group to which one belongs is the most important. Emphasis is placed on maintaining harmony within the group. So, and we make a career decision on what may be best for the family. Okay, next is time orientation. Time is cyclical rather than linear. Time is flexible and is to be used rather than dictated. The past is as important as the present and future. So, just to break that down, the party begins when I get there. Not, some folks have called it CP time. To break that down for those who are unfamiliar with that term, that's colored people time. That's a very old term. I'm saying old within the 1900s, but it expresses a broader idea of time can also stop too. So if you're having a great time with friends or family and we get caught up in the spirit of the moment, we may stay within that time. Okay, orality. Oral communications is important in conversation. Oral communication from sages and elders is especially valued. So rather than going to see a psychologist, before I begin to see a psychologist, or if I do at the same time, I'm going to go talk with my grandfather, right? And this is what I did when I was in my master's program. He raised 7 children, right? He knew more about young people than I would ever learn in a book. And I met with him each week, but that's a huge value, right? Next, sensitivity to affect and emotional cues. Attention is given to the emotional state of others. It's important to recognize and share the joy and pain of others. And you might have seen this or heard this kind of conversation. You good? We good? Or you mad? Yeah, we mad too, right? So I'm in it with you. I got your back. We're in this together, right? Verve and rhythm. So, and with this, one prefers movement and stimulation and changes in stimuli environment. So just to break it down, I can't sit down when the music is playing, or you probably shouldn't, as George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic would say in the now fabled song Flashlight. So you better get off the wall, sucker, and dance. Finally, balance and harmony with nature. Preference is to live in harmony with nature and appropriately use nature's resources. Right. Again, if you're interested in contrasting those with some Eurocentric values, you can take a look at that, and I can send you some of the notes. But also, you might be able to come up with some of your own, and I'd be curious to hear what those may be. Okay. Finally, some other variables to consider, right? So in taking a look at kind of African-centered values and ideas, Ellison in 2005 took a look at classroom learning preferences for African American students in K through 12, and consistently she found that cooperative learning was more of the preference for African American students. Not necessarily a locked in learning style, but more of a preference. Another theorist, Gaines, and a few other colleagues in 2008 took a look at African and Asian students, and that they did not differ in variables when it came to individualism and spiritualism, in that those weren't the highest value, but collective orientation was. Right? Thomas, Townsend, and Belgrave saw that in 2003, saw that high African-centered beliefs were linked to high self-esteem and self-worth. Also, high racial identity was linked to high self-esteem and self-worth. Right, and some folks have also seen that that's linked to higher academic outcomes, the higher your racial identity is. Afrocentric values were related to favorable academic outcomes again, and that's Williams and Chung in 2013. Afrocentric values delayed alcohol initiation, and Nassim and Belgrave found that out in 2007, or at least were able to share those results of their research. All right. So, I'm hoping we're trying to give you this idea that it's okay to look at the world as an African or Black person and view the world from that lens. Most of us have been looking from a subjective lens, not always knowing exactly where that subjective lens has come from. Okay. There's some measures for Afrocentric worldviews. And these measures are based on different Afrocentric dimensions within research, but also Maulana Karenga's Nguzo Saba, right? You know, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa as they're generally known, but this Nguzo Saba is also kind of an ethical theory that Dr. Karenga has developed. And I had the pleasure of working with him at Cal State Long Beach for the past decade. So, and those principles are umoja, unity. Yep. Kujichagulia, self-determination. Ujima, which is my birthday, so I usually remember that one. Collective work and responsibility. Ujamaa, cooperative economics. Nia, purpose. Kumba, creativity. And Imani, faith. Faith in you, faith in me, faith in all of our people. So in taking a look at those dimensions, I actually ran a counseling group when I was first in graduate school based upon the Nguzo Saba and wanted students to develop in those different areas. So there's different scales that have been developed, as I mentioned before, by Dr. Kimbone, by Molefe Asante, particularly the Asante Afrocentricity scale. There's a communalism scale. There's several others, some utilized by Dr. Grills for some of her research also. So if we're developing these programs, we're using, particularly for working cross-culturally, right? Because the world is becoming more and more diverse at every moment. We may have an African-centered frame or an African-American-centered frame, right? And that's generally my frame, I would say, because that's my lived existence. I grew up in America, but I was also very much aware as I was growing up that I am not like everyone else. So we have to consider, various programs that we may be running. And for example, I'm at a historically black college, but we have a growing population of Latino students. We also have students who are coming from not African American experiences, but Afro-Latino experiences, from Afro-Haitian experiences, from experiences from different parts of the continent, from Rwanda, from Ghana, from Nigeria, from South Africa, that are very different than ours. And when we begin to have discussions, there are some things where we diverge and some things where we come together. One of the questions that I will be having in discussions with our students is, at an HBCU, are there times where we put on a Eurocentric frame, and are there times where we put on an African-centered frame? I'd be curious to know from you what you think about that question as well. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you have some questions. If you're interested in notes, I could send those to you as well. Have a blessed day.